Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think we can now start. And thank you for coming to this session, which is on the financing, which is supposed to be the most exciting session of the day, because COP29 is the financial COP. So the way we are going, we have 8 speakers, all of them very, very high level, very brilliant people. And so I'm not going to be asking them questions. The way we're going to operate is that I'll make an introduction of maybe 5 minutes, and then I'll ask each speaker to speak, to take the floor for 5 to 7 minutes also. Open it up for discussion, and then go back to our panelists. So why is COP29 being called the financial COP? It's actually because it has 2 important deliverables that are on the financial side. The first deliverable is to agree on a new NCQG. Now, I hope all of you know what is an NCQG. An NCQG, for the very few of you who don't know, is the new collective quantifiable goal. It is the famous $100 billion that the North has promised the South a while back. So that is the first deliverable, is a new figure of that. Second deliverable is agreement on rules and guidance for the implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the one that talks about the carbon markets and carbon pricing. Concerning the NCQG, if you look at the recent data from OECD, the objective of actually delivering 100 billion from the north to the south has been met in 2022. Actually, the figure for financing of climate is around, depending on which data set you use, is around 106 billion for 2022. But there are 2 problems with this data that the South are going to raise. The first problem is that the promise was that this money would be additional and new. And actually, at least 30% of this money is reallocation from development spending into climate. The second problem that the South will raise is that more than half of that money is in loans. So from the southern countries' point of view, we are being asked to finance mitigation, and most of the money is for mitigation, very little adaptation. So we're being asked, we are the poor countries, we're being asked to finance mitigation, which is a global public good, at the expense of less spending on health and education, and at the expense of higher debt levels. As far as Article 6, and I was in a meeting, I attended some discussions with some G7 members following the bond meetings, and so the South will be complaining, some of the North will be complaining too. The North, especially the G7 part of the North, will be arguing that some non-traditional donors need to come up to the table and put some money, at least 20% from the new NCQG. That is what I was told by some representatives of the G7. And who are those non-traditional donors? Mostly, the number 1 is China, number 2 is Russia, and then you go down UAE, whatever. So that means also that there will be a problem on the geopolitics based on that. Now, on Article 6, the idea is to have a carbon market where actually countries, say a company in the north that has to meet certain regulation on the carbon emissions, whether it's the carbon is being taxed or whether there's a limit on overall carbon, can meet those requirements by financing green projects in another country, say in a country in the south. And that this then would allow for, it's a win-win kind of solution. It will allow money to go into mitigation projects anywhere in the world where it is most needed, and it would allow, and that would, countries can use that. So even countries can use the investments in other countries to meet their national objectives, national determined targets. So COP29, to be practical, COP29 will need to deliver on those 2 points. That's why it's being called the financial COP. But I also hope that would at least start a debate and a discussion on a new system of financing climate. Because what we have now, and if all we do is come up with another NCQG, and to get a small change in the carbon markets, although I think carbon markets are more important, that will probably not be enough. I believe that we need to make a major change. And maybe COP29 would be an opportunity to start a discussion around what a new system for financing climate could be. And I would like to quickly just put on the table 2 possible proposals. The first proposal, which I had mentioned before, is the creation of a green bank that will only do mitigation. If you look at that, green bank would be different from like all the development banks that we have now, World Bank, etc., in that it will not only be countries, but it will be private-public partnerships. So it will have countries, it will have private sector, it will have civil society. If you look at the amount of money that is needed for investment every year in the global south for climate, it is $2.4 trillion, $2,400 billion. And we are talking about 100 billion, so we really need much more. If you break that money down, the 2,400 billion, it is 250 billion needed every year for adaptation, 300 billion needed every year for loss and damage, and 75 billion needed every year for the just transition. These are the data from the G20 paper. Those are all adaptation, loss and damage, just transition. Those are national public goods and that are usually provided by the public sector. So those can be financed in our existing system using whatever money is provided by bilaterals or multilateral banks. But the biggest chunk that is needed is in mitigation. That is $1.8 trillion, 1,500 billion for renewable energy, and 300 billion for natural resources protection and agriculture. And those are global public goods, and they are also could be delivered by the private sector. I think that we need to put in place maybe an institutional system that works with the private sector to finance that mitigation without building debt in the South. My second suggestion, talking about debt, is that today half of the poorest countries in the world are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. When we faced the situation in the last century, Ismail will remember, we put in place something called the HIPEX, Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. And under that system, HIPEX, which we started in the 20th century, was countries got debt relief on condition that they use that money to fight poverty. So there was an agreement with the debtors on what the spending will be on for poverty reduction projects. And we will ask, and therefore, and on that basis, countries got debt relief. Now, and the IMF, the World Bank, were asked to monitor this agreement. What I am suggesting, that's something that maybe we should start discussing, is why don't we do the same thing now, since we're facing the same debt problem, but instead of saying fighting poverty, we say use that money for agreed climate action projects. So that would be my second proposal. But I promised I wouldn't. I promise I will not talk again. I just wanted to put this, make this introduction. Both what are the issues, and that have been discussed so far, and what kind of new ideas one would like to put on the table. And let me start right away by passing the microphone to somebody we already know, because we saw him yesterday, we talked to him a lot, Mr. Yalchin Rafiyev, the lead negotiator for COP29.
Thank you, Mr. Ghanem, and good afternoon to all again. It's a pleasure to be here with you again. On the topic of finance in preparation for COP29, there are a lot of issues to be discussed, and thank you, Mr. Ghanem, for putting some of the most important issues on the spotlight. So I'll start with the negotiation track. That's on you rightly mentioned the NCQG and Article 6 are the major deliverables, and both has financial elements within it. And the major discrepancy among the views among the parties on NCQG is that who should be paying the amount that we will be agreeing. And in this, who should be paying, in response to this question, there are a lot of legal and political arguments brought up by some parties, and it's also a matter of interpretation of the Paris Agreement, of Article 9, how developed countries are interpreting it and how developing countries. And some bring it up that it's a global effort. Yes, developed countries should help developing countries to pay for their transition, but at the same time, as it is a global effort, developing countries should also be a part of this process. But for developing countries, especially those, as it was referred to in the convention, in a capacity to do so, I wouldn't name any country, but we can assume which countries we mean. They prefer to have their own assistance or grants or concessional funding on a bilateral basis, as a South-South cooperation, let's say. And they want to keep the finance flow from north to south and not from south to north or in any other alternative way. So this is a major hurdle in the negotiations that we will be trying to reach to a consensual outcome. On the OECD report that you have been referring to, recently it was released that in 2022, 100 billion target has been reached. Yes, we as COP29 presidency team welcomed this, but not as an outcome of this report, but the intention and the general dynamics within the global community that at least somebody is trying to do this. But if we consider it reliable or not, this is also a kind of subject to consensual consideration of the all parties. Like developing countries are not considering it as a reliable source, because it includes also multilateral development banks, private sector even funding, which is contrary to conceptual positions of some developing countries. Therefore, there are some questions whether we should take it as a reliable source or not. And another format, G20 and G7. When it comes to COP29, we definitely need to take into account how G7 and G20 are acting, because more than 80% of the global GDP is accumulated in these countries. And we need to see how they are acting and how their summits are delivering on climate finance so that we can take it as a basis for us. But it's also important to take into account out of the COP process tracks, like what multilateral development banks are doing, what international financial institutions are doing. The April spring session meetings that we have also attended as COP29 presidency team has demonstrated that there is a resource over there. So the money is already existing, but there is no mechanism to deliver it to the parties in need for that. And Many parties that we have met, especially the small island developing states and LDCs, they're complaining about accessibility issue for the fund. Like in Caribbean islands, some face natural disasters, and they apply for the global climate, the GCF and GEF, Global Environmental Facility and Climate Fund, but they get response after 2 years. And then, in this case, they don't need this money after 2 years. They need this to be a kind of a rapid response fund. And there were some questions and also proposals raised by small island developing states that maybe World Bank should allocate some funding for regional banks like Inter-Caribbean Bank in order to somehow respond to this kind of natural disasters immediately in order to address the consequences. We are very much looking forward to October annual session of the World Bank in order to see how MDBs will be acting before the COP. And also UN Secretary General in September during the high-level week of the UN General Assembly is going to convene the leaders of MDBs to see what kind of push from their side can be done in order to make COP29 success. Private sector, we yesterday discussed it a bit during the panel and also after in our discussions. Private sector engagement is very important. We should not only rely on public funds because the amount that we are talking about, trillions, billions, they are not only possible through the resources of the public funds, and we should definitely get private sector on board in two tracks. One as potential investors in some countries and also as corporate social responsibility as part of their corporate social responsibility portfolio. Another issue is how countries are coming up with some initiatives, like as country platforms, establishing some initiatives, funds like UAE did last year with Altera Foundation Fund, or some other countries with bringing up some initiatives of funding mechanisms. This is something that would be also useful as they have the potential to accumulate some money to allocate for transition funding. And yesterday also we talked to Madam Espinosa about debt structuring and debt relief issue. Many countries, especially in Africa, LDCs, small island developing states, they have a debt issue, which is really a big impediment for them to fund their transition or to provide a necessary amount of funding for their climate-related activities. So therefore, we need to somehow trigger discussions or deliberations within the MDBs and international financial institutions. At the same time, we should encourage the parties on a bilateral basis to think about any debt structuring, debt relief kind of initiatives, which will ease the burden on developing countries to not to think about their paying of their debts, but more concentrate on their activities related to climate action. And especially COVID-19 pandemic impeded really them and slowed down their progress. And finally, Azerbaijan's COP29 presidency's action agenda. We have several initiatives that are also based on finance outcomes. Like we have some initiatives on investment, trade-related initiatives, and one initiative is on startups, to eco-startups, let's say, to encourage the countries to come up with new ideas on environmentally friendly startups that could be also part of the finance ecosystem of their own countries and also contributing globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rafiyev. And actually, thank you also especially for raising the important point about the difficulty that countries are facing in accessing those climate funds. Do you know that there are 60 multilateral climate funds in addition to all of the bilateral ones? And those 60 multilateral climate funds actually disperse around $3 to $5 billion a year, which is like peanuts when you are looking for $2,400 billion. So this is something that it might make sense to consolidate all of that in one big green initiative. Let me move right away now to our second panelist, who is Jean Baderschneider. I don't need to present Jean to you. Everybody knows her here. And she's on the board of directors of Fortescue Metals, and she is also the chair of the board of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. So, Jean, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hafez, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. I'm learning so much from all of you, so it's a real privilege. Before I jump right in and start to talk about ideas related to financing, I just want to make a couple comments because of discussion yesterday on political sustainability. We all know the scientific evidence and the scientific urgency of acting now. But we also know that climate finance is a multi-decade endeavor. We're not going to come up with something and resolve it tomorrow. It has to last over time. So the solutions we come up have to go beyond the election in the US, which I heard a lot about yesterday. They have to go beyond the elections in Europe, have to go beyond any one country dominating and carry key global players along the way. So we need a real sustainable approach. That said, right now, there's dwindling political support for even domestic decarbonization. I can feel it percolating in the US with the Trump candidacy. I can see it in the elections in Europe. And take the UK, which has been a long proponent of consistent and enlightened action on climate change. You see some fraying of the support for massive investment there. And this is all happening now before we even consider how to increase foreign aid for climate finance. So the time of uncertainty that we're all in, and it certainly is an extraordinary time, there seems to be almost a reflex to sacrifice climate action. And that used to be the case because people thought, well, climate happens tomorrow. But we now know with weather, you pick a place, look what happened in the Hajj, look what's happening in the US, look what's happening in Southeast Asia. Pick a place, weather is having a huge impact. And so, how do we go forward on financing? I think we need a creative set of solutions where we cut fossil fuel subsidies first. So, that's my leading line. We cut fossil fuel subsidies first. And then we allocate public finances to get green energy projects up and de-risk first mover activity straight away. So I want that first line to be in your head. We have to cut fossil fuel subsidies now, right? And then reallocate public finances to really focus on green energy projects and de-risk first movers. We need a solution that is sustainable politically, as I just mentioned, and economically for many years. So with this framing, I want to talk about three streams of activities. There's a lot more, like I'd like to come back to the fund, because companies, I know our company is creating a fund, KKR has a fund, BlackRock, all doing climate, and we probably need to think about that for COP29. But I'm going to focus on three streams of activities. First, and this is consistent with our chairman over here, our moderator, we need to see significant reform to the global financial system. There's no question about that. Put simply, the World Bank, IFC, and other key entities should have a duty to consider the emissions reduction benefits of a transaction. So when they consider what they're going to invest in and finance, there's a duty to consider emissions reduction. This would ensure the terms and conditions of each transaction is appropriately aligned to the delivery of that objective, which is what we're all about here. Enumerated emissions reduction objectives and the key documents of international institutions could also help to overcome barriers and bureaucracy to deliver effective climate finance. So that's the first stream. Second stream, we need to incentivize ambitious, with a capital A, voluntary corporate action that could set the framework for public-private partnerships, which I'm building on our moderator's comment. Large corporates right now should be subject to reporting requirements on how they allocate funding for emissions reduction initiatives. Not just that they're funding emission reduction initiatives, but how. Because sometimes it's not really adding value from a climate change perspective. They should be setting ambitious, science-based targets, and then publishing fully costed plans for decarb in line with those trajectories. That has to happen, and it costs money. I'm on a board right now of a company. We've committed to this, but we also had to set aside $7 billion to do the decarbonization because we're a key emitter. It's the only way that's going to happen. Many corporates see acceleration of deployment of grid-scale renewables as the most cost-effective tool for policymakers to make a dent in emissions. And McKinsey has some recent estimates that indicate 60 to 70% of least cost options for real zero, because we're headed to real zero, not net zero, big difference by 2030, will be through distributed renewable power. And that's going to be very important. This is great news, right? We were talking about this at lunch at our table because the technology already exists to do that. Wind, solar, geothermal, et cetera. And these are the building blocks, low cost, built renewables for secondary order solutions like green hydrogen, which can act as a battery for renewables. So incentivizing corporates to deploy these solutions will enable governments and markets to appropriately price in carbon risk for key industrial actors. So when decisions are made about investment, you price in the carbon risk, if you're clean or not, and reward those with better terms who act with clean plans. For example, there are right now only a small handful of companies that have actually published UN-compliant climate transition plans, which outlines back to my original comment about how they will achieve their targets. This is an important requirement that we need to action, and that speaks to the deeply embedded principles of transparency. Companies also can move faster than policymakers can many times. So, and they can make strong commitments themselves to ring fence fossil fuel subsidies. So if we don't have the institutional guts at the government level to stop all the subsidies, companies can ring fence those subsidies and use them to invest in green projects as on a voluntary basis. So, voluntary actions incentivized by corporations. The third stream, we need to support direct action by governments that support PPP development, public-private development, bilateral government support, insurance risk reduction, and direct development support, such as CapEx grants to support capital costs for green projects, or price support mechanisms to close the gap to fossil fuel, are powerful tools. In the future, and those exist in a lot of the developed world, in the future, we must move to a place where there are similar measures made available in developing economies that we are seeing in the developed world. Production tax credits, you may be familiar from the IRA in the US, it reduces the gap to gray, between green and gray. Technology co-investment schemes, and guaranteeing offtake. Long-term offtake agreements are the single scarcest commodity in the green world. They just don't exist, and it's the only way you can monetize investment when you're talking about billions of dollars. Action must also take place on emerging market risk reduction, because right now countries like Kenya, we talked about yesterday, have external financiers saying that they will charge twice the interest rate compared to a project in the US. McKinsey in this same recent study estimates $450 billion is deployed annually in climate finance to support renewable energy in developing countries, and it's 20% of what we needed. So that flanges up with your $2.4 billion needed. In my view, there is no way to get there without, first, a large increase in concessional capital, where capital is pooled from wealthy countries to support developing economies. Second, there's no way to get there without the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. That was my very first line that I hope is embedded in your brain, and the redirection of those funds to green energy projects. Third, and this is less talked about, but developing countries need to have significant reductions or complete elimination of public debt or elevated borrowing costs. In Africa, 14%, many of you know this, of continental income is spent on debt service, 14%. Having that capital to repurpose is essential, and we need debt for climate swaps. Swap out debt for action on climate that can be originated at NGOs By reducing borrowing costs through repurchase agreement market, interest burdens can be critically lowered and free up the necessary capital. Fourth, we cannot expect private capital to flock to developing countries without deepening local financial sector through improved regulation and oversight, risk assessment frameworks, or capacity building. That kind of architecture is really boring to everybody, but it is absolutely integral. If we don't offer a way to achieve green growth now, countries in the global south will rely on fossil fuels for their development, and we're to blame. All of us here, we're to blame. Finally, climate finance committees by countries need to be enshrined within their commitments, need to be enshrined within their nationally determined contributions and their NDCs under the Paris Agreement and subjected to similar principles of non-regression. Right now, climate finance commitments are not held in the same internationally significant category as emission reduction targets. We believe, or I believe, that there is scope for this to change as the world sets the next NDC commitments before 2025. This would subject climate finance targets to higher levels of scrutiny. So I'll stop there and pass it on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jean. Thank you especially also for raising an issue, or the issue of subsidies, of fossil fuel subsidies that we have not discussed before. I think that is extremely important.
70 trillion.
Yeah, it is extremely important and an important source.
70.
So it is not just that you make more money available, but you also reduce the consumption of fossil fuel as prices go up. The other point that you made also, that you underlined, is the role of the private sector and the link with debt. And the interesting part about getting more private investment rather than public debt is that you avoid increasing the indebtedness of already highly indebted countries, and that is really the way that we need to
you
go.
get out of that circle.
Exactly. So thank you very much, Jean. Now our third panelist is the Chief Executive Officer of COP29, the Deputy Minister of Energy for Azerbaijan, and that's Mr. Elnur Soltanov. Mr. Soltanov, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the very interesting discussion that you have been leading, and thanks to the speakers so far. So, Excellencies, as you know, very well know, the bedrock of 1992 UNFCCC, and then probably we can skip Kyoto, and then 2015 Paris Agreement, is that developed countries do it, and at the same time they'll help developing countries do it as well, right? So we have this very famous phrase, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And the main philosophical, conceptual, the backbone of these agreements, the spirit of the agreements, is that there are more responsible parties who have produced most of these greenhouse gases. And as you know, we filled 80% of the budget already. For 1.5, we have only 20% left. And ironically, those countries that developed with the economic models that created so much greenhouse gases, which is warming up our planet, by developing, they also acquired the means to implement the reduction in greenhouse gases. This is kind of paradoxical. And those countries that are still developing, because they did not pollute the world, they don't have capacity and means to reduce greenhouse gases that they have. Of course, there are now subtle differences and not so subtle differences with very powerful countries emerging, but in general, this is the picture. And then, to move forward globally, there was this deal, and it was struck between developed and developing world, and developing world said that, look, guys, we didn't do so, and we don't have means. So you should do it, and help us do that. And they came up with that phrase we call means of implementation. It's finance, it's technology, and it's capacity building. And the idea was that you pay us for us to take steps in that direction. And it's not happening, right? And that is the dilemma we are facing also at this COP. And this 100 billion, it's not about 100 billion. It's about whether this mechanism that seems to be the only way out is going to work or not. I mean, how much of the solution was 100 billion so that we will multiply it 3 times and it's going to solve 3 times more problems? No, it won't. I mean, 100 million was almost of no use, and 300 billion or 400 billion won't be of any use either, because mechanism is not working. And this is that I think international relations theory has very good explanations on why what is happening, right? So we are living in this anarchical world with sovereign states, and sovereign states are just that, they are sovereign. And if today there are certain countries whose position is more in line with the future of the globe, it's not because they care about the world more than others. It's because it's in their national self-interest to take the path they are taking. And somehow it happens to be in line with the interests of the global community. Every single country takes a position that is guided by their national self-interest. But simply some of their positions overlap with global well-being of the international community, and some of them don't. So nobody can here brag about that they are doing more than the others. So the situation is really dire, and the situation is actually somehow tragic. So what is interesting also is that all the major negotiation line items we have in CQG, Article 6 and Loss and Damage Fund, all of them are about finance. So this is really good, and I believe that COP29 will be success in that regard. I don't think there is, unless something really, really bad happens, Azerbaijan will be there to lead, and we believe that there are going to be outcomes on all 3 major fronts. Of course, there are other issues on the negotiation list as well. But again, we should be really focusing on how we can solve this problem, and therefore action agenda items will be as important. So if you want, I will be probably cutting short. I mean, my own take as we participate, as we become part of this global, very interesting debate, and again, as you are becoming part of this debate, you feel how your national identity is being challenged by your global identity as well. I mean, it's kind of, it shifts your identity, very significantly influences that as well. But I mean, solution is the market forces. Unless you bring in market forces, there is no solution to the climate crisis. No solution to the climate crisis. The world moved out of coal in 19th century to oil, which is less polluting than coal, not because the countries of the world got together and made a political decision to do so. No. Shifting to oil made more economic sense, and that's why they did it. And the climate crisis is going to be resolved not because of political decisions, but when market forces, when saving the world, will also turn profit, right? This is the only way for the climate crisis to be resolved. And I think our task here in this process is to speed up of coming of market forces. That's it. If you want to help, if you want to contribute your 5 cents to the solution of the climate crisis, just speed up, do whatever you want to do, whatever you can do to speed up the coming of market forces. What it means that when building green energy, renewable energy plants is cheaper than, and okay, we have different numbers, but they are not really reflecting the reality all the time, unless they are significantly cheaper, also considering that we have this huge infrastructural sticky points that will prevent transition. Then fossil fuel power plants, it won't happen. And therefore, I really commend and I very emotionally follow the technological advancements in green energy area, be it automobiles, be it, again, renewable energy plants. In fact, probably sectors related to energy will be much easier to tackle, and it's good news because they account for about 70% of global emissions. Agriculture will be a challenge, waste sector will be a challenge, and to cut short, what I'm trying to say is that, of course, we will be successful. Of course, there will be good results. And this is also important. I'm not downplaying the importance of NCQG. It's a big battle. Article 6 is a big battle. Loss and damage fund is a big battle. But at the same time, this is more about keeping the momentum up, legally speaking, procedurally speaking, even in terms of discourse. I mean, I really like how this climate discourse is penetrating the entire world and creating its own societal forces, which we should appreciate. But at the same time, we should be thinking about these real steps that will, as I said, facilitate and speed up his or her excellency, the coming of market forces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Soltanov. Thank you, especially for making the point that it is national self-interest that is driving countries' decisions and not interests of the planet. Actually, you reminded me of something that one very famous development economist, Shanta Devarajan, who teaches at Georgetown University, was telling me the other day, which is, he told me, you know, the problem, Hafez, is that the people sitting at the board of the World Bank are people representing their country's interests. They're not representing the planet's interests. We need to add some independent voices who are not representing a country but representing the planet. I think that this is a very important point. Also, this very important point that you made is that the solution is the market forces. And that is why actually reforms and getting Article 6 to work might provide the market incentives that Jean has been talking about for corporates to invest more in green energy, green technology in general. Our next panelist is somebody also who does not need to be introduced to you. Is Maria Fernanda Espinosa herself. So I won't try to introduce Maria Fernanda. Maria Fernanda, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, moderator. I really thought you were going to read a couple of pages of my CV or something. I'm joking. I think that there are 9 speakers in this session, so
no, but if you want, I can.
No, no, it was a joke. It's just for you to wake up. Yes, I'm worried. I don't know how to say and package everything I would like to share, knowing that there are, I think, 5 more people in this panel to speak after me. So perhaps then the solution would be not to speak about climate finance, but about something that is connected. And I've been carefully listening to all of you. And, you know, basically, in a nutshell, the question is, if we have the science, and every minute we have science news with more information, more sophistication on the data, et cetera, we have the knowledge. So, and we have the technologies that are out there and getting cheaper and improving by the day. And we also know that we are living in an emergency, you know, in a climate emergency situation. And basically the question is that the actions do not have the pace and the depth that are needed in an emergency situation. And the more I hear, the more I think we understand that climate is not an environmental problem only. So when the difficulty is when we negotiate climate targets and goals, including on climate finance, what we are negotiating at the end of the day is development pathways. We are negotiating trade. We are negotiating social cohesion. We are negotiating jobs. And we are negotiating power sharing and the place of countries and sectors in the geopolitical landscape. That is why climate negotiations are so politically charged and so difficult. It's not that we don't know enough about what is happening. So, and I would like to come back to the core principle that is enshrined in the Climate Convention, which is the CBDR principle that the previous speaker already mentioned. Why is this so critical when we're talking about finance? Because the changes in the geoeconomic and geopolitical context make this very principle very difficult to apply, these common but differentiated responsibilities. The concern of many of the emerging economies is this division between Annex 1 and Annex 2 and developing countries and the responsibilities that they have. And this is so tangible when we're discussing climate finance. This is, of course, doesn't help the sense of urgency, the emergency mode, and we understand that the pace of the negotiations are slower than the speed of the crisis. So it is not about finance alone. I would say it is about the overall package of the means of implementation. And also there was mention about technology, access, affordability, the issues of intellectual property, and the issue of capacity building. So it's not only about the money, but it is also about the money. And the lack of money or the excess of money is not an arithmetic issue. It's a political issue. And I think this should be, clear to all of us. Some have said, and I heard also, we don't need a quantum. We don't need a number. We don't need, at the end of the day, an NCQG. But the issue is that we already have several reference numbers of the amounts of money that are needed. The latest report of the convention, the UN Climate Convention Standing Committee on Finance, already provided a number. The Sunway and Stern report on climate finance speaks about 2.4 trillion a year for developing countries. The G20, the independent expert group, is talking about emerging markets and developing economies, of course excluding China, but the need to mobilize 3 trillion annually by 2030 to achieve the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So the numbers are there, so it's not that we don't know. We know what the numbers are. The numbers are in the trillions, and we see, in spite of that, how difficult the NCQG negotiations are. And the issues that are still unresolved, and I think that we should focus perhaps on these issues, are the quantum, the numbers, the sources of funding, the contributor base, who has to pay at the end, the issue of access, the issue of transparency, of concessionality. I mean, these look like very technical issues, but are also, political issues that are on the table. And, the only option for this is the continued dialogue to reach agreement on the technical and political aspects. And that's why the coming months are so critical. And the role of the Azerbaijan presidency is so important. And why is this so important? Because this agreement is going to unlock all of the other aspects that remain, yet up in the air a little bit. The global goal on adaptation, the mitigation, the just transition, that are progressing, but then are kept in a slower pace, waiting for the NCQG to be agreed upon. I want to say a word and just coincide with our colleague of the Ban Ki-moon Center on the need to really rethink the finances for adaptation. The adaptation agenda remains heavily underfunded. And I think that that's a core issue in climate action for developing countries. This was already mentioned this morning. And also both adaptation finance and NCQG and a loss and damage fund that is fully operational is critical for countries, especially in the developing world, to show greater ambition on their NDCs, on their NAPs, the National Adaptation Plans, and their BTRs. Basically, what we see is that the package of resources, the NCQGs and the 100 billion, honestly, after all these years in climate negotiations, the OECD report, I have, my concerns about having reached 100 billion in 2023, because no country says, I have received the money I need. No country in the developing world can say that because of bureaucratic difficulties, because of access difficulties to the several funds that are out there, the 60 regional funds, but also the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility way of operation. I would like to say also that there something that has been mentioned by you. I have the privilege to co-chair an initiative that is called the Debt Relief and Green Recovery Initiative. We presented our latest report in Bonn a few days ago, and the report basically found that 47 out of the 66 economically vulnerable developing economy will face insolvency within the next 5 years, and basically they require urgent debt relief, a debt relief push, so they can deliver on their climate commitments, but more importantly, on their development commitments and on their SDGs. There is, hopefully by COP29, we will have the first results of an expert review on debt and climate. There is an expert review process that is being sponsored by Kenya, Colombia, France, and Germany, with the support of the DRGR initiative, to show us that a debt relief is absolutely urgent and should be part of the climate finance package. But this is also cannot go along without other issues that need to be addressed. The current negotiations of a global tax treaty, global taxes and global wealth taxes are also critical for climate finance. And I would say that besides debt in taxes, there is an issue that I think Mr. Rafiyev already mentioned, which is the overall need to rethink and work on a reform, a profound reform of the international financial architecture, especially looking at, the arrangements, the governance arrangements, and the capital that multilateral development banks channel for climate and sustainable development processes. I know that in the space of the climate convention, there are fears to discuss about debt issues and about the reform of the multilateral financial architecture, but I think this can perhaps be a space for the action agenda of the presidency. We cannot speak about climate finance without addressing the issues of debt, of global taxes, and without discussing the issue of the reform of the international financial architecture. And a mandate for a reform will hopefully come from the Summit of the Future in September. So we're very much looking forward to that, and very much looking forward to supporting the COP presidency in these very critical issues. Over.
Thank you very much, Maria Fernanda, and especially, I think, we fully agree on the point on debt. It's clear that there is a need to have a debt initiative. The common framework, that is the G20 debt common framework that's in place, is not working fast enough. Only 4 or 5 countries have been able to use it, and it's not linked to climate. I think it should be replaced by something that links climate to debt relief, and that covers not just low-income countries, which is what the common framework does, but you also want to cover middle-income countries. That is, I believe that this is a very, very important point. The other important point that you underlined is all the political issues, the political problems in the negotiations. And in a sense, it takes me back to Mr. Soltanov's point, is that we will only succeed if we actually are able to provide the kind of incentives for the corporate sector, for the private sector to change their behavior. And that is something that we need really to work on. Let me move now to our next panelist, who is sitting right next to me, Vladimir Norov, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uzbekistan and is the Secretary General of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization until 2021.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a great honor for me to participate in this high-level meeting. And I would like, to, first of all, to thank leadership, the Ganjavi International Center, for inviting me and join to its expert teams. And as yesterday and today focused, fundamental economic shocks caused by climate change not only threaten food security, but also underlining public health with ripple effects on poverty, inequality, displacement, political stability, even conflict. And past climate disasters have resulted in permanent gross domestic product losses of 5.5% in Central Asia and 1.1% in the Middle East and North Africa. Moreover, these disasters will only become more frequent, according to recent IMF research on adaptation and mitigation. Investment of up to 4% of GDP annually are needed to sufficiently increase climate resilience and meet emission reduction. But as today rightly mentioned, that mobilizing more private climate finance is vital, not only to mitigate emissions, but also to build adaptive capacity through investment in climate resilient infrastructure. This is particularly important for Asia. Asia accounted for about 2/3 of global growth last year and will grow again this year, but its heavy reliance on burning coal as energy source means it accounts for more than half of harmful global greenhouse gas emissions. Emerging Asia and developing countries need more investment, and today the private sector manages more than 210 trillion in assets, but only a very small fraction of these assets are allocated to climate investment. Yesterday it was proposed to establish some mechanism, platform in framework of COP29 for attracting private investors. But Green Climate Fund was established under UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2010 and is the world's largest specialized multilateral climate fund. The world's largest multilateral climate fund, despite its effort to engage with the private sector has had relatively little interest in initiating and co-financing GCF projects. In September 2022, 47 private sector projects out of 207 were approved. 5 of these 47 have expired and are no longer being implemented. A major challenge for the private sector in GCF is the accreditation process of the organization, which is too time-consuming and cumbersome. The long time it takes for a project to be approved by GCF is another reason for the lack of interest from private sector. On average, a private sector project takes 228 days from submission of a funding proposal to approval by GCF. So it is, I think, should be given special attention for raising efficiency of this mechanism. But at the same time, private climate finance is currently still depressed, and it is important to prepare financial rules for a potential manic phase in which huge amounts of private finance will seek investment opportunity. At the same time, the financial sustainability of developing countries is critical to cooperative global efforts to tackle issues such as climate change. And recently, the talks in the Hong Kong's about this issue, Dilma Rousseff, the president of New Development Bank in Shanghai, said that developing countries borrow money, they must pay much higher interest rates to developed countries. For example, businesses in African countries borrow at a rate that is 4 times higher than in the United States and even 8 times higher than in Germany. The external debt of developing countries now amounted to 8.7 trillion US dollar in 2021. The rise in global interest rates resulting from monetary tightening by central banks such as the Federal Reserve of the United States and the European Central Bank has escalated debt servicing costs, especially for countries with a foreign currency denominated debt. At the same time, analysis by the UN Global Crisis Response Groups showed that 3.3 billion people live in countries where public interest expenditure exceeds allocation to education or health because more money they're spending for servicing this, their debt. Debt for development swaps, often a good solution. And debt for development swaps have attracted now widespread attention, receiving not only the endorsement of multilateral organizations like United Nations or IMF, but also growing acceptance by debtor governments. More than 100 billion US dollar of debt in developing countries could be freed up to spend on restoring nature and adapting to climate change, according to new analysis of International Institute for Environment and Development. And recently, ahead of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund spring meeting, which began on 14 April this year, this institute is calling on international financial institutions and G20 to promote debt swaps as an important tool for tackling the debt crisis in those countries most at risk from climate change. They mentioned that money that could help restore damaged ecosystem and protect vulnerable communities from food or droughts is instead flowing to banks and polluters in the rich country. It is very important, certainly, for converting public debt at risk on default into financing for nature under a debt swap model can yield significant global benefits for ecosystem and conservation. So we're more talking about that's how collecting the money for solution for climate crisis. But we should look to the big potential which not yet use it, and it is the Islamic banking. Islamic banking now could possible to accumulate $4 trillion this year, till this year, more than $4 trillion. It is by Standards and Poor assessment. And in 2026, it will be $6 trillion US. But at the same time, sovereign wealth funds from Muslim countries are investing heavily, about 3 trillion in financial institutions and OECD countries. So, but Islamic capital markets, which include sukuk, it is investment such Islamic certificate, like bond in the traditional bank system, and asset management funds have combined asset of 671 billion US dollar. This is primarily due to the fact that Muslim population in most organization, Islamic State cooperation countries account for almost 50% of the world's unbanked population, when in developed countries it is 2%. And for example, in 2 largest Muslim countries, Pakistan and Indonesia, Islamic bank assets account for 15% and 5.8% total bank assets respectively. But at the same time, now we see, as in with the developing AI and with financial inclusion has become key issue, and fintech have played a key role in these markets in increasing financial inclusion. The global financial technology industry is booming. For example, European financial technology market is valued 3.6 trillion. United States, 4 trillion US dollar. Fintech could be a catalyst that could boost developing countries' GDP by almost 3.7 trillion by 2025, according to the McKinsey Global Institute. If we're looking to the Islamic fintech, it rises from 93 in 2020 to last year 470. It is 4 times more, but at the same time in an Islamic Muslim country, 2 billion Muslim living. In the United States, with population 350, there are 13,000 fintech, and as I said, market is $4 trillion. But in Muslim countries, the amount of this rises from 40 billion US dollar 2020 to 306 billion in 2027. So, and the key area of opportunity is the role of Islamic fintech in activating the multi-billion-dollar pool of Islamic social finance. From zakat, it is compulsory charity, sadaqah, voluntary charity, and waqf, Islamic donation. According to UNDP, only zakat has the potential to contribute till 1 trillion US dollar globally to poverty elevation. This hidden potential of Islamic social finance, if successfully harnessed, could help overcome the annual 2.5 trillion shortfall in achieving in the UN SDG. So why I'm focusing on this? Because the population of Muslim population will grow. To 2060, it will be 3 billion population in Muslim population, and that's why it needed special attention, because poverty, climate crisis is growing in these countries, because this most parts of population not engaged in financing activity. That's why it is important to focus on this issue, to help by developed countries to these countries for developing their ecosystem. Because it is needed, it is I worked 3 years in China, it is very popular. Some saying that give a man a fish and you will feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. So it is important to focus to this part of the world, to Middle East and Northern Africa, to Central Asia, where is special attention for raising their own potential for dealing with the climate crisis and ecological disaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Norov. I think you made actually 2 very important points. I thank you for that. The first point is what you mentioned, that we have the Green Climate Fund exists, but the Green Climate Fund is unable to mobilize the private sector investment that is needed. And that is actually the point which I wanted to make, which is that the structure of our financial systems, the international financial system, is not built to get money from governments, not to work with the private sector, whether it's the Green Climate Fund or the World Bank or whatever. And that is why maybe we need to think about maybe we can change the Green Climate Fund into a public-private partnership. You need private sector people sitting there and not just government people. I think that's a very important point. Second important point you made is that actually the money is available. There's a lot of money in the financial systems around the world, and you focused on the Islamic countries. So money is available. We need to put in place the systems and the incentives for that money to be invested in climate action, which is also the same point that I go back to what Mr. Soltanov said, which really struck me, which is the solution will be with the market forces. So let me move quickly now to our next panelist, and that is Igor Luksic, our Prime Minister of Montenegro. Igor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hafez. It is really great pleasure to attend this high-level meeting and also take part in this very interesting panel. I think it is very hard not to repeat what has already been said, not only today, but even yesterday. And we'll probably keep repeating some of the things later today or tomorrow and so on, but it's just inevitable. I think that listening to the panelists, I also remember the film that Al Gore produced, which was called Inconvenient Truth. And I'm afraid that inconvenient truth nowadays is that in the growingly fractured world, in the growing trade obstacles, in the situation of the growing trade obstacles, new industrial policies becoming very popular in major economies, climate talks not really yet mainstreamed, unfortunately. It's going to be very, very difficult, whoever is the host country of whatever COP we're talking about, to reach any deal, including the one we're talking about the need to provide the mechanism to support financially the process of confronting the climate change consequences. Emissions are continuing to grow. In some regions, like EU, they are lower than they were 25 years ago. I think I discussed that yesterday with Ismail. Also in the United States, although 2 years ago, in the United States, it started to grow again. So emissions were higher than previous year, but in total, a bit lower than 20 years ago. But as far as the world is concerned, they're still growing, although at lower pace. And we haven't really yet started to see, again, except for example, EU region, that GDP has decoupled from emissions growth. That's very unfortunate, despite all the investments and all the intentions. So we need to take that into consideration. At the same time, I'll try really to make this intervention very brief and focused. At the same time, in the world economy of about $10 trillion, to me it's really hard to believe that 1 or 2% of GDP cannot be invested for SDG goals or for climate adaptation, mitigation, and so on. I think really one of the tasks for whoever is responsible is to start screening everything that's going on. I mean, I can tell you the example of my country. I can easily recall 1 to 1.5, maybe even 2% of GDP, wasteful spending, populist spending. It's populist spending. And we're talking about 2 to 5 trillion, depends what calculation we take, for the need of SDG financing. And this number is growing because we are approaching 2030, UN Agenda UN 2030, so we are approaching the year of 2030, so we tend to put all that together, so the number required is growing. But let's start with something. And I'm pretty sure that if we do a proper screening, we'll find easily out that some money which is already spent through budgets, existing budgets, can be rearranged easily. In my country, again, I can easily recall some social spending, some pension spending, even some investments, which are pure populist spending. And I'm pretty sure that all of your countries, you'll easily figure out that the same thing happens. So it's not that money doesn't exist. I think what we have to understand, unfortunately, is that nationally determined pledges are always a resultant of internal political dynamics, of vested interests, of populist policies, unfortunately growingly populist policies in many places. Secondly, it is maybe a bit of a contradiction to what I've just said, but I think that the world also needs a kind of a Hamiltonian moment. the example of what EU did a couple of years ago can be very effective with EU Next Gen. EU decided to tap into the bond market. In the world's economy of $110 trillion, the outstanding bond market is $130 trillion. So tapping into the bond market might be one of the solutions in combining private sector money or investments or whatever saving institutions are there. Of course, the problem with the world or global Hamiltonian moment is that there is no such developed structure, although many dots exist, which can be easily connected. But G20 exists. Institutions like World Bank exist. So I think it's worthwhile thinking about giving it a boost, giving it a boost of acceleration as far as the process of providing climate finance is concerned. In the EU, this bond mechanism is with 30 years maturity, so something like that can also be easily dealt with. And ODA, official development assistance, can also be used to actually repay some of those outstanding bonds in the future. Unfortunately, one of the problems we also have now is that official development assistance is not nearly where it should be according to, again, some of the documents such as Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which talks about 0.7% of GNI in the developed world. It's nowhere near. Some countries even cutting that further. So, some rethinking is obviously needed. Otherwise, we'll just end up being stuck in endless discussions about whether we recapitalize World Bank by 30 or 50 or 100 billion, what comes next with the climate facility, and so on and so on. It's just inevitable, and I think it was at yesterday's meeting where Mr. Hajia was talking about, proper stock taking. I think even doing that should be regarded as a big success of the Azerbaijani hosting of the COP29. I've never really understood why every COP has to end with 50 or 70 pages long declarations. Everything, or nothing about everything about nothing, or whatever. Usually, or even G20 declarations are huge, and it happens every year. So I can understand that, 5 or 10 years ago, we had a proper meeting, agreed on some action agenda, and then every year we measure the progress. No, it's not the case. So, if someone really would dig into all those declarations, it probably find so many things which are mentioned once and never again. So, I think we need focus, because we will keep on talking about examples of the heat wave in India these days, or some other anomalies. We'll just keep on talking about that. And we won't be able to do much. So at the same time, and the third thing I'd like to say is that private-public partnership, or partnership with the business sector, is absolutely necessary. Not only because of the need to tap into whatever bond market, but because business sector is really naturally probably, but more innovative than the government sector. We keep on talking about market failure in this and that, but what about government failures? Providing wrong incentives probably leads into overinvestment. We already have renewables overinvestment in some markets, which bring a lot of tumble for profits and prices, destimulating further investments. Why? Because government doesn't do its work, even in Europe, because grids are not good, infrastructure is not good. So some of those, projects, some of those investments, all of a sudden become unviable, turn into a very bad shape and people lose money. So, we tend to talk only about market failure, but actually I think the core of the problem is government failure. Last year was the first year where ESG funds were less than the year before, or ever before. You know why? I don't know, we can all guess, but I think it's probably because of greenwashing, but it's also because of political dynamics. I mean, in the United States, there's this initiative to set up a new stock exchange in Texas, which will allow companies, or which aims to ban companies who invest in ESG probably to get listed. So it's very confrontational. It has become very confrontational. The ESG, I mean, generally speaking, is very much Western story. It's not, global. It's not really a global discussion. So we need to find a way to bring business sector on board. Business sector is not a foe. It's really a friend here. And I think supporting innovative approaches about, electrifying some of the large industries or finding other solutions to technological solutions to support agriculture, or even turning oil industry into big carbon capture industry. That maybe sounds crazy, but I think that's the future. If we tend not to stick to some prejudices. Let's put it that way. This is where I end. Sorry if this has taken too long because it's already running a lot past time. But I wanted to emphasize these several items. So the need to properly screen where already money is spent. And that's also, I think, one of the roles, needed roles for international institutions. Secondly, to think about innovative mechanisms of bringing money into the story, tapping into the private bond markets, cooperation with the business sector, and we didn't talk much about carbon tax, carbon trade. This has already been covered by other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igor. And especially, the point that you raised that we had not discussed is the idea of looking at overall spending by governments. And there's a lot of what you call populist spending, and that this would be a source to look into. Our next panelist, also somebody that I really don't need to introduce to you. It's Walter Fust, and Director General of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and did many wonderful things in his career, and he's an important member of this team that you all know very well. Walter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I heard a lot of figures, and I am troubled by those figures. How can we put the figures we are talking about together in a way to make it understandable to parliaments, to governments, and to private people? I am absolutely troubled. I heard the origins. I have heard those figures all over. And I read, but who is at the origin? How was that calculation done? And so on and so on. Definitely, there is a lot of money needed. There is a lot of money available, especially in the private sector. When it comes to ODA, I agree that there are limitations. Don't forget, it was in 1971 that the international community put the postulate or forward that government should spend 0.7% of their BIP for development cooperation. 54 years ago. And where are we? There are 3 or 4 countries a little bit above 0.7, most of them United States even below 0.2, and others somewhere in the middle. And the issue is that ODA is not anymore development cooperation money to alleviate poverty. It became the cradle for all kinds of expenditures, from defense, migration, climate changes, even the limousines for head of states, airplanes, and so on. It's all in there. And the OECD is keeping that register. And it is completely eroded, and the share of that money allocated for poverty alleviation is very much diminishing. Whereas the money for other things are badly in need. There was a time 30 years ago where the concept of 3Ds was postulated. Defense, diplomacy, development. They should speak the same language. We have forgotten that because we were not able to really keep the line of developments without fracturing it. I mean, from shelter to survival aid, that's humanitarian, that's disaster relief. From relief to sustainable development, that is what you call should be the continuum without breaking, without fracturing the process. And then from sustainable development to climate resilience, let's say the newest adding of that line. But the problem is that this financing chain, if I may call it, never worked over the last 50 years. Because some people put money with different entities for humanitarian aid. It's good to sell in public. Others put money for development, others for reconstruction. And then we have all this thing not solved that is called tied aid. It's even not free spending money. It's tied to national supplies. So I am ashamed to say this of a very, very important range of activities, but I think it has to do with the notion that development cooperation or humanitarian aid became an instrument of foreign policy, which is wrong. It is part of foreign policy activities. But in humanitarian relief, in development cooperation, you operate according to goals you fix together with your partners in a given country. And if that is abolished, no wonder that nobody wants to invest. But please be aware, when it comes to ODA, the last word are having national parliaments, not the UN, not the World Bank, even not national governments. And this should never, never be forgotten, especially when you have to convince these fractions of political parties and where we have a very, let's say, weak lobby. I remember during my 15 years of tenure, I never left the capital in my country when I knew that the Finance Commission of one of the parliament chambers was in session, because it so quickly disappeared or changed in budgets. If you are not behind that, it's not working. So I'm saying that because bilateral aid is much more difficult to be accountable, because every program project is evaluated, is looked at, you have the 4 eyes, the 6 eyes principles, and all these control mechanisms. Multilateral, once it is in the bank, you can forget it. There is no, they have instruments, the World Bank, of course, the development banks, but you cannot check it out. When I spoke to politicians from my country, they said, we love multilateralism because we have exposure, we can go there, and we are not accountable. And then we have the other system of multilateralism, which is lacking of continuity. The whole UN system is underfunded. It's a scandal how it is underfunded. So, and you can even not spend money for 3 or 4 days. They don't have this opportunity to accept money over a couple of years. So I do not want to be a pessimist. I am absolutely optimistic that there can be changes coming up, but we have to be aware who is deciding what based on what, and what do you ask to be financed. If a financing is just a new pot to put somewhere some millions in it, you can forget it. Nobody's doing that anymore. So you need to come forward with what is it for, the clear goal, how it should be used, the mechanisms are clear. It's the same when you go for private investment. The first round or the second or the third for startups, but even for other investments. But when I helped 2 African countries to place loans on the capital market, international, I got heavily criticized by the World Bank. You are competing by helping them to take up money on the private capital market. Why are we not pushing or pulling the different mechanisms in the way to serve the cause? I am not at all against rethinking the whole financial system. We should do that by all means. But at COP29, I think we should at least discuss a kind of an adaptation fund for least developed countries. And I give a certain priority to Regional Development Bank to set it up. Why? The World Bank has still not corrected the IDA spending. There are still a lot of BRICS receiving IDA money. And this is simply not sustainable in the longer run. We should rethink those financing aims. It's easier to spend money in Brazil or in India than it is in a least developed country. And, but we should not forget when we mobilize money, maybe such a special adaptation fund, regional funds, could be linked with government guarantee schemes to finance, to guarantee private investments. But you should also come forward with investable deals or investable vehicles. Otherwise, it's difficult to get the private sector or the investors into it. Then, when it comes to debt, we definitely should, minimum for the least developed countries, rethink debt reduction, even propose debt reduction and make swaps for adaptation. This should be possible without changing the Paris guidelines or the adequate conventions, but it has to go through national parliaments again. And I experienced often in national parliaments, they said, oh, you are spending twice for the same partner the money, and the third time he is not paying back. Why are you doing that? So please also let us see how best we can do that. And this national parliaments, they normally want to know, of course, also the control and the accountability mechanisms, but there are still about 30 different auditing standards applied in OECD countries. The ICRC needs to fulfill or to obey 32 different auditing standards. When I was collecting money after my retirement for the Crop Diversity Fund, I often found private investors, they said, ready to invest, but bring me the auditing standard that I can put it properly in our balance sheets, that it might be at risk, there might be losses, but provide me an auditing standards that the shareholders are satisfied. Unfortunately, the colleague with whom I was working on that issue, he passed now away, and we are again at zero. But we need to rethink auditing standards in order to get the recognition by those who want to have a certain, let's say, safety where the money is and how it is used. And then when it comes to taxes, I think now as ODA is going through difficult times because of wars, reconstruction requests, and many other issues, migration, it is pretty unpopular to talk about new taxes when it has to be done in many countries because of the discussion of the debt break. And it's even the word green sometimes had a little bit a double connotation. So, but the word adaptation, in my experience in the recent 2-3 years, it has not taken damage. There should be a good argument. And then food security is something people are ready to invest, for sure. And the water issue, all the people understand. Even for national parliaments, we have to develop the proximity of concerns that there is a buy-in that holds on, and not just for the good stand in the press. So sorry that I was a little bit outspoken, but I am not accountable to anybody anymore. I can do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. Walter, you made an important point, actually, that I wanted to make, but I didn't have time, on ODA. Because I heard yesterday, I think it was you, Ismail, who said ODA is about 200 billion a year, which is the number that you get from the OECD. It's around 200 billion a year. However, when you dig deeper into the OECD table, nowadays ODA includes aid to Ukraine, which has nothing to do with development. It includes in-country refugee expenditures, which also has nothing to do with development. If you subtract those, then annual ODA has fallen over the last few years from around 200 billion a year to less than 150 billion. So I think the point that you made is really important. It's important for us because you look at the big figure from OECD, it says 200 billion, but actually it's no longer 200 billion because there are all those. I didn't know also that the president's cars were included in ODA, as you said, but I will not be surprised. Our last panelist, and I realize we have a big group of panelists, but all of the wonderful people who are giving us very important insights. Our last panelist is Alessandra Rokaslavu. I'm sure I screwed up your name there, and I apologize. She is the UNDP Res Rep here in Baku. Alessandra, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. Rofshan felt that you need one more panelist, so here I am. As mentioned, I'm the resident representative of UNDP here, and I want to talk about one topic, is the tools and vehicles for financing. I can tell you now that we're supporting every COP presidency, the G20, the G7, but let me give you something tangible. Like Mr. Fuss said, ODA, the time for ODA moving the climate needle forward is over if it ever was. So now, let me go to the core. Let's talk about climate justice. And you're like, here we go again in the UN, another buzzword. No, this is actually really important because in the global south, there will be places that might be inhabitable in the future. So these people are moving, and then we're talking, when there's irregular migration flows and people are searching for a better life, and then in Europe we're going on about the burden it poses on the elderly and on the aging societies, and this is fueling populism, and at the end of the day, it's calling for easy solutions. Easy solutions don't exist. If they were existing, all of you that are politicians, you would have implemented them, yeah? And this is, at the end, a backlash on democracy, so which is the topic that Maria Fernanda was talking earlier. So there's a lot at stake when we talk climate change and climate justice. What vehicles do we have for that? We have a good one. It's called Integrated National Financing Framework, INFF. We like a good acronym in the UN. Obviously, Azerbaijan has one as well. It's joined 85 other countries in basically defining and implementing its sovereign priorities under government leadership. So let me give you a few examples so you can actually put some ideas to what it means. In Indonesia, for instance, and Mr. Norov mentioned it earlier, we have mobilized over $10 billion in green sukuks, SDG bonds, blue bonds, and unlocking capital that was available but was not invested before. In Pakistan government set up an SDG investment in climate facility. There is a pipeline with over 60 projects for a market capitalization of $9 billion US. You heard correctly. That money is available, it wasn't invested. Now, let me give you a very, very small example. Benin, it's a small country in Africa, the first LDC ever to issue an SDG bond. They raised 500 million. Let's give people the kudos they deserve for going out of the way. But you see the common theme here. We're talking debt, we're talking bonds, we're talking concessional lending. So it's not necessarily that there's new money, it's just financing instruments being used in a blended manner to raise the liquidity that the capital markets have to address this fiscal gap. So if you look at the most advanced financing frameworks from 17 countries that are very reform-oriented, that show that we have mobilized under this scheme 16 billion to date, and there's projections, I think it was a study that you also quoted, on over 30 billion in existing public and private capital. This is a massive potential. Here you can talk about transformation to scale. This is beyond what ODA could ever do. The point is we have to bring it to maturity by having trust in the markets, by having trust that governments put out good regulations, that they're putting out good incentives, that consumers take good decisions when purchasing, when exercising their purchasing powers. And at the end of the day, I want to add one more topic also, that we should also rethink our educational system about, are we doing civic education? Are we learning something about economics? I'm an economist. I learned everything that I know in the subject at university, nothing at school. I mean, maybe the math, but everything else later. Yeah, that can't be. I think young people need to be educated on that. So what does this mean for the topic we're discussing now, NDCs and climate finance? It means that if we are using these tools together in sync, we get exactly what also Walter was talking about, the trust of the market, an investable product, because it was locally generated and it reflects the priority of each and every country. So we have a robust framework with that. So I would appeal to you that the multilateral system is not dead at all, but that we are on an eclipse and that we are out here understanding that we will utilize, as well as everybody else, private capitals and incentivize transformations of structures in an innovative manner. So as the global community, we have been given the tools. I would say, let's not be afraid to use them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. And actually, you made a very important point that we had not touched upon. but we should have, which is the use of different financing instruments, the different types of bonds. You mentioned green bonds, blue bonds, SDG bonds. Actually, when I was at the World Bank, one of my favorite bonds that I worked on was rhino bonds in South Africa. And it's amazing how people actually want to buy those instruments because they believe in the cause. And I think if we need to think about really climate change bonds or how that would work. So thank you very much.